Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of A Time Out with Tony. Today, as always, I'm excited about having my guest on here. I know that once you hear his story and hear this gentleman speak, you're going to be just as equally impressed and excited about listening to him as he's going to drop a lot of wisdom on us this afternoon. So without further ado, it is my unequivocal pleasure. I got to use some big words because he's a doctor. It is my unequivocal, my exceptional. I'm just excited to have you on here. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Willie Bradley. Doc, welcome to the show.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate having an opportunity to sit down and just talk with you and kind of share my experience in life as a police officer and just in life in general. So it's really a pleasure to be here, man. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely, man. It's my pleasure. It's been a long time coming to have you on the show, so I'm glad we can work it out today. Doc, I always start off by having my guests tell the listening audience a little bit about yourselves. Just give us a bio, if you could, about where you from, where you grew up. Just give us so people know a little more about who Willie Bradley is.
Okay, sure. I'm really originally from Augusta, Georgia. I spent the first 10 years of my life in Augusta, living under Jim Crow, to be honest with you. Then my parents migrated up with the second black wave of black migration up from the south to the north back in the 1960s. I arrived in Boston in '67. And so a large majority of my life was spent right here in Boston, Massachusetts, where I educated. Went to Oliver Wendell Holmes Junior High School, Archbishop Williams High School, and off to the military and back into college, and registered as a stockbroker. Worked on the stock market for a while, got bored with that, and then became a police officer. I spent 22 plus years of my life in law enforcement here in the city of Boston. Retired in 2010. Went to Walden University, got my PhD in public policy with a focus on criminal justice. And now I'm a professor an adjunct professor as a member of Curry College staff, as well as in the college staff, as well as Massasoit Community College. So I've been around, I've been doing a lot, and and I'm just sharing my knowledge with folks who are willing to listen to me.
Doc, you said a lot right there, and you started off by talking about your childhood growing up during Jim Crow era down south. Mm-hmm. And moving with that second wave, the second migration up to the north, where a lot of we know that from history accounts, a lot of black folks from the south moved up here looking for a better opportunity, looking to get out from under an oppressive system.
Right.
But interestingly enough, I want to build on that. But my next question is this: what role? Because you mentioned your parents. What role did your parents play in the man you've become today?
My parents played a significant role in the man I became today. Both my mother and father, as well as my older sister, being the oldest of 10 kids, she had to leave school early and take care of the household chores and get us ready for school and do the things that our mom would do, because my father and mother were both illiterate. They were forbidden to go to school in the South, and so they did not have a quality education. But my mother had a very deep-rooted respect for education and what education can offer her kids, which is one of the reasons why she said she migrated from Georgia up to Boston. And my older sister, who's still here, she's still among us, she's still among the living, she lives out in Revere, had to leave school during the eighth grade year to take care of us, the kids. And so her education was limited, but we tend to provide as much as we can for her because she had to do that ultimate sacrifice. Being the oldest of 10, she had to make that sacrifice, and she did it willingly, and she did it unselfishly. So we are in a great deal of debt to her for what she was willing to give up. So absolutely. I say that what I should also add is that in the South, my parents made sure that all 10 of their kids had a deep-rooted respect for authority, and that respect started in the home. So my mother and my father would lay down the laws for the home, the rules for their home, and if you don't obey them, then you had to suffer the consequences. Usually the consequences meant a belt, or my father would say, go out on the edges and pick a switch, boy, I'm gonna take care of you. But what happened is that it gave me a deep rooted respect for authority. And I often say to people, all authority, respect for authority is local. It starts in your home. If you cannot respect the rules and regulations of your parents' home, chances are you're not going to respect the rules and regulations of society, and we happen to call those laws. So that's where I got it from. And so I grew up to be a cop, after going through what my parents put me through for disobeying. Right. I wasn't the kind of kid that always obeyed what they told me. I was always trying to test the edges of the tolerance, put it that way.
Sure. So so that leads to the next segue, because you mentioned that, and that's why I always like to hear the role parents play, because we owe our parents a great deal of gratitude, right? Yes, we'll never be able to pay that debt. But I always like to hear what values, what are those things they instill, those morals, and you talked about it, following the rules, yes, early on in you that helped you become and shaped you into the man you are today, and you still carry that with you. Now you talk also, Doc, about coming up here and doing a number of occupations. You said you went to the service and you came out stockbroker. What led you to jump into the police department?
What really led me, to be honest with you, is I guess it would be an innate or deep desire to serve, to serve. During the time that I came up, I felt that my skill set as a stockbroker was serving the wrong segment of society. I guess that's the best way to say it. And I felt that I was making the rich and richer whenever they would give me an opportunity to do what I was registered to do. That was very seldom, because again, I was a Black man in a market, in a profession that was pretty much occupied by white men. And my president was deeply repudiated by people who were making the decisions and the authority figures in that particular profession. So that was one reason why I left. I didn't really have an opportunity to reach my potential. And the other reason why I left was because I just didn't want to be cooped up in the office all day. I wanted to get out and really do something for my community. And I felt that, being a Black officer in the Black community would put me in a position to help young Black boys and Latino boys and boys of color to move forward in life on a positive note, as opposed to being introduced to the criminal justice system on a negative note.
I wanted to add to that question, Doc, because you just touched on it. I was going to ask you, how did you deal with that? I'm sure you wrestled with, you're a Black man, you just dealt with Jim Crow, you come to Boston, you just talked about the experience you had, and even in corporate America on Wall Street, not letting you get to that certain level because of your skin color, your race. Now you're wrestling with a profession that hasn't been known to be kind to Black folks and in the Black community, and you're a Christian. Mm-hmm. So now you got the double whammy. I want to know how you got past that and was able to deal with a profession that you probably saw some of life's worst atrocities, some of the worst things you could ever imagine, but also some injustices. As a Black man in the Black community, you're a police officer representing that badge. How did you get through that?
First of all, it was very tough. That's the first thing. It was very, very tough because I had my own set of personal morals that I felt that I was not going to waver or not going to deviate from how I felt, how I should police my community. So that led to shouting matches, fist fights, struggles in the locker room between myself and my white counterparts in law enforcement. So that's the first thing. Second thing was that arresting people was the last option that I felt that I needed to do as a Christian. Because I think if I arrest someone, I'm introducing them into a system that's already designed to oppress them. So I'm actually becoming a conveyor to a pseudo plantation-based system. And I just felt very uncomfortable about that coming up through Jim Crow, for the first 10 years of my life, and being in Augusta, Georgia, being born in Augusta, Georgia, I felt very strongly about not introducing people of color or anyone into the criminal justice system if I could help it. In some cases, you had a situation where you could not help it because the severity of the crime did not give the officer, me, the flexibility to try to take another route or do another approach to resolving this issue. So it was challenging as a Black man in law enforcement. And also it was challenging as it relates to dealing with the police culture, because the culture says, it's okay to enforce the law aggressively when you're dealing with people of color, but it's not okay to enforce the law aggressively when you're dealing with people that are not of color. It's not stated that way, but the way that you operate, the way that you move, the way that you actually exist in the culture, it becomes abundantly clear that you have to be very careful when you're dealing with someone who's not of color. So it was a challenge, and to be honest with you, Tony, it is still a challenge to this day when I'm questioned by members of the media about how police officers are trained, what they, as opposed to their actions. When I am teaching criminal justice leadership, I talk to officers about being careful about going to the arrest as the preferred option. Because oftentimes when people are going through issues and police officers are called into the situation, there are undercurrent social issues that are existing that's actually percolating beneath the surface that are causing that problem. If you can actually get involved enough to kind of figure out what are those undercurrent social issues, you can actually resolve the problem without bringing down the heavy arm of the law. So that's how I looked at it.
It's funny you mentioned that the dichotomy of how you enforce the law in one community, and it's implicitly not, it's just implicitly done one way, but in another one it's not so much with the heavy arm of force. Which brings me to what we're talking about, where the policing is today, Doc. And you and I have had this conversation off camera numerous times. But when we see the current state of the police today, and many of these soldiers, many of these cops are coming out from military background training. When you're in that training for the military, you're training for war. You're trained to go. You're going over to Afghan, Iran, Iraq, wherever you're going. You're training to go to war with people of color. Now you come home to civilian life, you become a police officer. 9 times out of 10, they're going to put you in an urban community where you're going to see more people of color. How can you deprogram that, Doc? They've been trained in the military to see people of color one way, then they come back to a civilian job, get into the police force, they go to the academy, but how can you deprogram that kind of training so that they can see people of color just as human beings and who need to be treated with respect and dignity? How do you deprogram an individual who's gone through that type of pathway into the police force?
But Tony, I'm not really convinced that you can deprogram it, to be honest with you, because I'm of the school of thought that you can over-militarize your police force, and policing in Fallujah is not policing in Boston. And I feel that there's 2 ways you can over-police or militarize your police force. One is you can actually supply it with training and heavy-duty military surplus equipment. And the other one, you can actually supply with people who are coming from the military with that mindset. One of the things that I advocate or I push is that we change the model by which we train our police officers. In the academies around the country, they're using what they call a stressful model to train police officers. And what that is, it's similar to a boot camp. And I often tell my students who are trying to get into law enforcement is that when you go through the academy, the best way to describe it would be like going to college and boot camp at the same time. I happen to think that that's not the best approach when you're dealing with law enforcement, when you're training people to do law enforcement in a civil society. Because again, you're not trying to conquer a hill. You don't have that military mindset. You shouldn't have it. You know, when you're doing the majority of your work as law enforcement officers, 67% of police officers' time are just sitting around waiting for things to happen. That's what we calculated in Boston. So what I often say to folks is that we need to demilitarize our police force. Okay, we need to do that. And we need to change the model from a stressful model, which is like a boot camp for training, to a non-stressful model, which is more like a scenario-based training, where the officer is put in a scenario and he or she, the recruit officer, and then he or she then are given an opportunity to come back to the table with solutions to that scenario, as opposed to you're doing, you know, people are yelling at you and screaming at you and getting you to a point where you feel like you have to use your weapon, so on and so forth. Most of the time, I went through a large part of my police career and never drew my gun from my holster unless I was training. So I say that the majority of people are law-abiding citizens. I think we need to rethink the way that we're training our folks. That's one hit. Now, my other hit is, I think that when we do the initial recruiting of recruit officers, we pay more attention to aptitude and very little attention to attitude. You know, yes, you have to have the aptitude to be a police officer. You should have a basic skill set. You should be able to write, read, and do the things that we normally do as an individual in a sophisticated, educated society. But you also have the right attitude to understand that you are carrying an awesome amount of power in a society that's predicated on the freedom. So, but you have the authority, and there's no other industry or no other profession in our society where you can kill someone if the circumstances are correct and be completely exonerated. You know, right. So that gives you a lot of power. And so you have to have the right attitude when you're carrying that 40 caliber Glock. You have to have the right attitude when you're dealing with people from all walks of life, regardless of if they're white or black. I often say to officers, listen, you should always go into your encounter with an individual with the attitude of a lamb, and let the individual himself or herself cause you to move your attitude from the lamb perspective to the lion. You should never ever go into a situation as a lion. Right. You there, Tony?
Yeah, I'm here, Doc.
Okay, for some reason I lost you. That's me.
I'm still here. We're still live.
Okay, I got you. Okay, so that's my hit. That's my hit.
So Doc, you mentioned demilitarize. Mm-hmm. Explain the difference between demilitarizing your police force and defunding, which is a hot topic button right now. So people who are listening right now are hearing these terms and watching it in the news. Just explain the difference between what you just said in terms of demilitarizing and defunding the police force.
Okay, well, demilitarizing means is to get away from the military mindset. When an officer is dealing in the military mindset, every army needs an enemy in order to have its existence, in order to sustain its existence. You can't have an army if you don't have an enemy to focus on. When the U.S. Army was extremely mobile and focused on training and had money coming from everywhere because they had an enemy called the Soviet Union. So they were actually gearing up to fight that particular enemy. Today it's China. So every army, every military, in order to justify its existence, will have an enemy. So if your police office department is thinking like the military, then the enemy will become the community. And it's usually becoming the people who are less fortunate in the community, the ones who do not have the resources to actually challenge officers when they violate their constitutional rights. And so therefore they just walk away and say, well, I have to take it because I can't pay this guy or lawyer $60,000 to challenge this guy. You know, so when you have a military mindset among your police officers, that military mindset looks for an enemy. Oftentimes the enemy would be Black and brown people in the community. So that's what I mean by demilitarizing the police force. Eradicate that military mindset. Defunding is a whole nother concept. Policing, a large part of the municipal budget is contributed to, given to policing. And what defunding says is that, maybe we should rethink how we fund our police force. It doesn't mean to eradicate the police department. It doesn't mean to eliminate the police department. It means to rethink how we're funding the police department. Perhaps we might want to take, some of the money that we're giving law enforcement and give that money to other supporting entities that can help law enforcement when they go out into the community. For instance, give a good example. When I became a police officer, yes, I had a college degree. I had my bachelor's degree from Johnson & Wales University School of Technology. So I had that. But when I went through the academy, I knew nothing at all about dealing with mental illness. That never even creeped into my lexicon, of training, any of that. So, but yet, oftentimes I'm dealing with people who are suffering from mental illness. Why not have a section of policing funds to go towards people who are experts in that area? And those individuals could be called on when the call for service enters the communication center. It could be triaged in such a way that it's determined that not only would I send a police officer, I will also send a member from the mental health entity, and a police officer would be the supporting role, not the lead role in that kind of situation. So that's what we mean by defunding, removing some of the funds that we're giving to police officers, giving it to other entities that can help police officers maintain control or maintain the law, or maintain.
So shifting some of the resources to offer additional services when the police officers go out to support them, who may be better equipped to handle it. Got it.
Absolutely. So see, what's happening, brother, is that, and I'll go back in a little bit of history here. The very first law enforcement agency in the country was Boston. 1838 was that time that the Boston actually put together the municipal organization for policing, for professional policing. That didn't come to life until 1854. So New York became the very first operational police force in 1845. Okay, so, and Boston was very active in the Slave Fugitive Act and returning slaves back to their owners and so on and so forth. But what I'm saying to you is that originally, Boston and other police departments around the country was not created to do the things that we're doing today. They were created to provide an alternative source or an alternative enforcement to civil disorder that was happening because of this, this growth of urban environment, because the country was predominantly agricultural. So as the Industrial Revolution moved in, people started to congregate and live in these urban centers. And then because they were living in these urban centers, they began to fight for resources, jobs, housing, schools, and that blew off into civil disorder. So that the militia was no longer an appropriate means of addressing these issues. They needed a full-time professional law enforcement agency that was working day and night. That's really a nutshell of why we came to be as we are today as policing in this country.
Now, Dr. Bradley, you mentioned earlier in your introduction that you were on the police force for 22 years and you retired as a deputy superintendent. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
What drove you to make that decision that you were going to step away from the police force? What was it that drove? What was the deciding factor? If there's more than one, please share. But what was that deciding factor that you said, you know what, it's time for me to leave this profession and to do something else with my life?
Well, it was actually two issues. One issue was I had, being from the South, I had very little tolerance for racism in law enforcement. And in law enforcement, if you don't adhere to the rules of the culture, then your life could be in jeopardy. So that was one piece. I was known as one of the individuals who were not tolerated. And so I was getting pushed out from that piece. And the other piece was that I really wanted to teach. At one point I was the registrar at the Boston Police Academy, but I had obtained the rank of sergeant detective, and that was really a sergeant's position. So they had a union issue. So I really wanted to teach. So I wanted to, and I knew I wanted to become a professor, and I had to get a PhD to do it, but I could not stay in policing, so things started to unravel in law enforcement, and I decided that, hey, no, this is a good time to step away and do other things. And I'm relatively young. I want to be able to enjoy my life and release some of the stress, because police can be very, very stressful, and it can actually wear you down very quickly.
And switching gears from that, so you decided to move into something different.
Mm-hmm.
You decided to change your career, but also you're still involved in somewhat in law enforcement. And what I want to ask you is, how did you determine that you were going to maintain a connection to law enforcement, though you're in the classroom now and you're trying to teach the next generation of officers? Is that the most effective way you thought that you could still be involved and make an impact to change some of that culture you talked about earlier?
Yes, I believe that, and I hate to put it this way, but in my in the culture of my former profession, it's probably your ultimate futility to try to change the minds of officers who have been so saturated in the culture. So I think if you really want to change the culture, you have to start with the young minds that are coming in. You have to encourage the old minds to move forward and move on and do other things with their life while they have time, and kind of educate the young folks so that when they come in, they can identify that effort to change their minds, after they have gone through police training, and they can actually come into policing with a new mindset, with a whole new mindset on how to do the job. So I felt like being in the classroom and being at the college level in the classroom, which is probably the best place to do that. Also, teaching at a master's level, I get an opportunity to teach some of the old folks who've been in the job for a while, and it can be challenging. But because I was a police officer, and I have dealt with some of the same issues that they've dealt with, and interact with some of the same people they interact with, it's easier for me to actually talk to them and rationalize with them and show them what you're doing, what the culture is pushing is wrong, especially in the 21st century. People are looking for a new way of policing.
So, Doc, before we end this segment and switch to your segment about your faith and being a strong man of God, I want to ask you, right now, there's somebody listening to this broadcast. They're in that valley of decision, contemplating whether or not they're going to join the law enforcement agency. They're an African-American man or woman. They're conflicted based on some of the things that you've dealt with. Like they're seeing the injustices, they're seeing Black men getting shot down, they're seeing all that. So there's that side of them that's really seeing that happening, but they're thinking they can make a difference, possibly like the same mentality you had. What advice would you give them as they're sitting there contemplating whether or not, the police, law enforcement is exactly the occupation that I can have, and can they really make a significant difference and change?
So my first advice, my first thing I would say to them was that you can't make a change if you don't get involved. You can articulate all you want to. If you don't get involved and understand the operation, understand how policing works, you really can't make a change. You can talk about it, you can articulate it, you can explain it, but you're not in a position. If you don't play, if you're not in it, you can't do it. My second my answer to the second question, I'm sorry, what was the second question again? I'm thinking so quickly.
No, it was really just how do they get past the same barriers you had? I mean, being African American in this community, watching the injustices, and thinking that maybe that, if I get into law enforcement, I can make a change. And I ask, how do they deal with that? What advice would you give them to help them get through the same barriers you had years ago? That question still lingers today on my personal convictions, my moral convictions, and jumping into an industry where I may be conflicted. How do you help them? What advice would you give them to make that decision?
My advice to them would be not to let the power of policing overcome their perception of themselves. That would be my advice. A lot of times what happens, and I see this all the time in law enforcement, people get a badge and they get a gun and they think they're a superhero. Not to let the power of law enforcement, you have an awesome amount of power, not to let that become more important than who you are, your morals, who you are as a person, who your parents have built you to be, who have helped you become. Don't lose that. You know, what I did was I always stayed, I did two things when I was a police officer. I never hurt someone for doing things that I have done, you know, because I use myself as the, you know, as a template, you know, and I never lost sight of the fact that I'm a man of Christ. I'm a man of God. I never lost sight of that. And so when I saw that person in front of me who were doing something wrong, I realized that in that person is the Lord. In that person is that's God's temple. So what can I do to help God's temple clean itself up? That's how I looked at it. Sometimes it worked, Tony, and sometimes it did not. I'll be very honest with you. But that's how I looked at it, you know, and the pressure I was getting from the culture, from my colleagues, was one of the reasons why I decided, you know, it's time for me to move on, because they wanted to not lock him up, you know. No, this individual has a problem, drinking problem, whatever the case. How can we help this individual? What can we do as a police department to make this go away in such a way that we're not coming back here again? You know, in some cases we could not do it. Some cases we had to introduce the individual to the criminal justice system. But that would be my advice. Don't lose sight of who you are because you have the authority. Don't let the authority supersedes your opinion about, you know, who you are and your love for Christ. I think personally there's not enough Christ in policing, to be honest with you, but that's how I did it.
I think that's good advice, Doc, not to let yourself get lost, because I know, again, I'm sure my brothers and sisters who are still on the force right now wrestle with that question every morning they wake up going to work. And here we have another incident of a rogue cop who just shot another black man. I don't know how you become numb to that. And knowing that, you know, there's that blue shield we know about, and we keep hearing about the good cops and all the good cops, but these few bad apples, yet we continuously see examples of the bad apples outperforming again. And I'm like, man, how do you wrestle with that as a black cop, that this is I'm proud of this shield that I wear in my occupation, but I also struggle with the fact that this is continuously happening.
Well, you know, it is a struggle, brother. But you know, the point here is that people always look to training when we see white officers killing unarmed black men. But training is not a panacea, because listen, Tony, black officers are not shooting white men. If training was the issue, then black officers will also be shooting white men. It's not training. It's the culture that we're in that's actually pushing this ideology or this notion that you can actually kill this person and get away with it because of who you are, because of the authority that you have, you know? And I think, again, is that, and I'm thinking about a conversation I had a couple of weeks ago with one of my students about the Minneapolis George Floyd situation. And I basically said to him, that wasn't that officer's first rodeo. It wasn't his first rodeo, you know, and that's time and time again, every officer that's involved in this shooting, I can guarantee you, it wasn't their first rodeo. So that says to me, so what is management doing? What is leadership doing? Because
right.
Policing can be a job where very few leaders are held accountable for their subordinates' behavior. I have never seen a situation like that where you're getting paid to be a supervisor, but when an officer does something stupid, you're not disciplined no way, shape, or form. How is that okay when you're responsible for making sure that a person is carrying out the services correctly?
Right.
You know, so I think we need to rethink not only how we're policing, but how we operate within the police force, you know, among each other. So you can't be, you know, if you're having, you know, racist practices internally in your law enforcement agency, my God, the community is at your mercy. Because if you're doing it to people that dressing, putting their lives on the line like you are, then what can that say for the community member? If you're going to treat a black officer with total disregard, disrespect, and racism, what are you going to do to the individual in the community who's not an officer, but is Black?
Right.
It's going to be even worse. So we have a lot of work to do in law enforcement, man. There's no question about it.
You know, Doc, I appreciate your candidacy on this topic because I know that is, again, it's personal to you because you've lived it. And now you are, as a adjunct professor, you are putting a thumbprint on the next generation to try to help change that ideology of how you treat people and see people. Right. While you are doing the job that, again, sometimes, let's be honest, it's a thankless job. We understand that. But there should be some level, I don't know what training you need to just see people as people and treat them as human beings with dignity and respect. I think that's something that you mentioned. It's not about training. It's about training that heart, change of heart to see people as people, not always as a threat. Well, go ahead, Doc.
I just think that, you know, that is a big piece. I think, again, I go back to, we pay more attention to aptitude than we do attitude. You know, I think it's important that we understand that it takes a certain type of person, a certain type of attitude to be a professional law enforcement officer. To be able to look at people beyond the color of the skin, look at the human being. You know, I just can't see heaven being white on one side and Black on the other. I see heaven as being souls, regardless of what color that soul was contained in when he was among the living, or she was among the living. So I don't see that person as a white or Black person. I see that person as an individual who I need to service as a police officer. And that's not hard. That's not easy to do because some folks can rub you the wrong way. I mean, I have had situations, Tony, in my law enforcement career, especially in South Boston, where I was told, you know, I don't want this N-word in my house. And I'm here to service you, to protect you. And I call for a South Boston police officer, and you send me this N-word, you know? And, you know, I was like, okay, if that's the case, then, you know, I'm just going to leave and call it a day because you don't want me, I can't do it if you don't want me in your house in a conversation. So, right. So you have to be able to maintain control of your body, of yourself, your temperament, and you also have to be able to, you know, do your job. Just do your job.
Now, Doc, I want to segue into who you are as a man of God in Christ. You mentioned that throughout the interview, your strong Christian values. I don't know where that came from, you know, what led you to be such a strong man of faith. But that's something that you wear near and dear to your heart. Mm-hmm. And you're proud to confess that you're a Christian. Ever since I've met you, you've been proud to profess Christianity as who you are as a Christian. Why is that so important to you, Doc?
Because it's important to me. Number one is my grandparent, my grandfather was a pastor, and in Georgia, it's a small little town outside of Augusta called Girard, Georgia. And there's a church in Girard called the Giving Groves Baptist Church. My family members, including my daddy, are buried back there, going back to slavery, going back to the 1830s, 1820s. So that church produced a lot of Bradleys and Givens and Petersons and all my relatives who are pastors. So I was raised for my first 10 years in Georgia. We used to go to that church. So I got a chance to see the elders in my family preach and love the Lord while I became a rambunctious young man and kind of try to do what young men do, if you get my drift, and kind of drifted away from the Lord. But as you get older and as you understand that He is your guiding light, He is your GPS, you begin to fall back into line. So I proclaim my Christianity because God is my source. He's my strength. He's my patience. He's my tolerance. He's my everything. And I keep myself at an even keel because I have Him in my life.
Excellent. And as a result of that strong belief and that fundamental background you got from your grandparent, you are now a minister. You pursued it to the highest degree, which is a common theme for you. Same as in education, you take it to the highest degree. So when I call you doctor, in our community, we affectionately say doc all the time. But the doctor, you've earned that by earning your PhD. So you took education to the highest level.
Right.
So now I see the same pattern with you in ministry. You're walking a walk of faith, but you also decided to take it the next step further and to minister. And you are now pastoring at your, and give a shout out to your church, your name of your church. And you are now pastoring sermons now.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, Hosanna International Ministries with Pastor Drew Ambrose and Patrice Ambrose, who are fabulous pastors. In fact, Patrice is one of my favorite pastors. No, gig on Pastor Drew. I told him his wife is an excellent pastor, and she brings it. In fact, this Sunday I'll be pastoring, preaching this Sunday. I'm preaching on repent, explaining repent, and I'm using dirty clothes, filthy clothes, and 180 degrees as a way of explaining what repent is all about, and it's coupled with forgiveness. So I have all that. I'm working on all that now as I'm trying to repair my deck. I'm doing it in my mind. But I served under Pastor Alexander Hurt at that time it was a Kingdom Church of Christ over in Brockton. It has gone through quite a few names. That Pastor Hurt is no longer there, but Pastor Drew was trained under Pastor Hurt. Pastor Drew starts his church at Hosanna International Ministries, and he asked me to come along with him to help him with the word. But it's a way that that I love the Lord, man. And I think that when we get Christians in policing, or people who have faith in policing, then we can actually become a better police force. We'll become a better servant, because Jesus was a was a servant. Right. He was a servant leader. You know what I mean? So when we think of it from that perspective, then I think that we become a better force.
And you certainly are all about serving, Willie. That is without question. I've watched you. I've watched you walk, and again, I'm watching you as you're growing and pursuing excellence in ministry as well. And I just wonder, I just think of all the people, the lives you've touched, both as a policeman, former policeman, and then what you've done post your career. And what's the end game for you? All this is said and done. When you sit back, what's the end game for you when this is all said and done?
When it's all said and done, the end game for me, it was that people that look like me and people that look slightly different than I, the people that look drastically different than I, can actually call on my former profession and be serviced with the same level of respect, regardless of what they look like. When I see that, then I think my work is complete. I want to be able to speak truth to law enforcement and speak it from a man of that has a deep love for the Lord. So it's not that I'm saying, I got you. I'm saying, let's do better. Let's be better. Let's include the Lord in what we do, and so that we can be guided by our heart, not because of what the individual looks like. We can use our heart. What if it was me in that position? How would I want you to deal with me? What if the woman that I'm actually trying to save was my child or my mother or my sister? How would I want that officer to deal with deal with that situation? So when I can actually sit back as an old man, and I can look back and say, okay, an officer responded to a call for service, and he had an opportunity to make an arrest, and it was his discretion, but he also looked at what are the undercurrent problems that are causing this to happen. And maybe we can look at it from this perspective. And when I can look at a true police reform, where we're looking at the 13th Amendment, and we're rewriting the 13th Amendment so that it doesn't say, oh, by the way, slavery is okay, if you have been incarcerated or you have been convicted of a crime. So therefore our criminal justice become our pseudo plantation. So when we can actually truly have reform, then I think my work will be done. That's my end game. So I tell you that now, brother, I have a whole lot of work to get done.
And no doubt in my mind, Dr. Bradley, that you will get that done. You have a beautiful, supportive family that's giving you that push. You just mentioned your pastors who you admire and look up to, who are giving you that push. And then you have that inner drive in which you innately got from your parents. Doc, my last question for you, because I know there may be someone listening right now who's saying, man, I'd love to connect with this brother. He's just got so much wisdom. How do you decide the individuals you're going to pour into? Because you poured into different individuals through both your occupation as a police officer and as a man of ministry. How do you decide who you're going to invest in? I use the word Jegna, in which that I don't, it's not mentoring, but it's along the same lines. But it's about that person who's a gatekeeper of the community. How do you decide who you're going to pour into?
I look to the Lord for that decision. To be honest with you, Tony, I can see the Lord in the person. We all individuals have to make a decision. Are we going to stay in the Word or in the world? Or we're going to try to straddle the two. When I saw you, I saw the Lord in you. I saw the love for God. When I saw Keith Ford at Randolph Public Schools, I saw the Lord in that brother. You know what I mean? And so what I tend to do is look for where the Lord guides me. And in some cases, I have been involved with folks who are actually straddled, who's at the fork of the road. Should I go left and become more worldly, or should I go right and become more wordly in the word? And I have, and the Lord just pushed me in that direction to help that individual make that decision. So I really look, God is really my GPS. And you would know the individual is wrestling with the issues around who they are by how they deal with other people. One of the things when I work at Randolph High School, you see these young brothers, these young boys who are looking to try to get into, what can I get into in my life that can make me more like you or Mr. Price or Mr. Ford. And I explained to them, this is what I did. This is how I did it. But be mindful that because of the skin that you're in, the society is going to actually look at you as, what are you doing at this level? You shouldn't be here. You know what I mean? There are certain expectations. One kid I explained, I used the scenario, I used the analogy of a Christmas wrap, a Christmas gift. I said, think about this now. Christmas is here. All these gifts under the tree. Everybody's pulling the gifts out and everybody's wrapping, pulling off these wrappers. And there's one black gift. No one wants that gift. No one wants it. Why? Because the paper that it's in is black. But the moment they pull that black paper off and get to look at the content of that person's character, they realize that I should not have judged this individual by the color of their skin. Do you want to be that person? Because they already got expectations about who you are based on what you look like. You know what I mean? Do you want to be the individual that when they get to know you and go beyond your skin, they realize, you know what, I was wrong. Because if you can be that person, you have now just corrected a mindset. Just change your mind that could actually be, that could be used to change minds in the future. So that's how I look at it, brother. It's that, it is what it is.
That's good stuff, dog. I like that. You said the Lord leads you to those individuals like a GPS. I like that. And I think the people who are listening, this is just a short segment with Dr. Bradley. He and I could talk for hours. I mean, as you just listen, he just dropped a lot of wisdom and nuggets. And I am just thankful that I got to him for a few minutes. I know that you're listening to this. You learned something from him. You got some valuable wisdom and nuggets. Again, as I always tell you, if you're being encouraged by this podcast, feel free to reach out to me. I can also connect you to Dr. Bradley. personally offline if you ever want to reach out to him and just, you know, just pick his brain a little bit more about the subject of law enforcement, ministry, whatever you want. This brother is very knowledgeable. And I promise you at the beginning of the show that you're going to be excited and you're going to learn something. So every time I sit down with Dr. Bradley, it's a learning session because his brother just has so much. So Dr. Bradley, thank you again for being on today's show. I really know that the people got something out of it. They got a lesson in life and lesson in policing and all that, but we were able to tap into your wisdom, guys. So our brother, so I just say thank you.
Well, you're welcome, brother. And don't make this a last invite, man. I'm more happy to come back.
No, I'll definitely have you back, brother. You can believe that.
Yeah, it's no problem. And if someone wants to reach out and talk to me, I'm more than happy to, you know, Zoom and we can talk about law enforcement and what law enforcement is all about, how I see it changing, because I do see a change, Tony. I see a change for the positive. And I think one of the things that you want to see throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is, and just mark this down, civilian review boards. Civilian review boards, you know, are CRVs. And I think that is where we're going to go, where police departments are beginning to look at how can we use this as a way to incorporate the community into the policing process. Excellent.
So you've heard it here first, folks. Again, you know, I always like to leave up by telling you until our next time out, be safe, give thanks, and look for opportunities to encourage and serve others. Now it's time to get back into the game. God bless.
Amen.